Great. Well, I'll start. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening with our third Oxford Contemporary Opera talk of this term. My name is Zelina Vuliami. I'm the president of Oxford Contemporary Opera, and I'm delighted to be announcing Dr. Kamala Sankaram today to this talk with our company manager, Priya. Kamala Sankaram has been praised as strikingly original by the New York Times, and she writes highly theatrical music which defies categorization. She's had commissions from the Glimmerglass Festival, Washington National Opera, Houston Grand Opera, the Prototype Festival, and Shakespeare Theatre Company. She's known especially for her use of cutting-edge technologies, and recent compositions include Only You Will Recognize the Signal, which is a serial space opera performed live over the internet, Looking at You, which is a techno-noir featuring live audiences and choruses of 25 singing tablet computers, and so on. A particular favorite of mine is the Parksville Murders, which was the world's first virtual reality opera. As a performer, she moves freely between the worlds of experimental music, creative music, and contemporary opera. Kamala, thank you so much for joining us today. I will now hand over to Priya, who will be conducting this interview. Tablet computers and so on. A particular favorite of mine is the Parksville Murders, which was the world's first virtual reality opera.
I think we have a bit if Guy, if you want to mute the Oxford Contemporary Opera feature.
I will now hand over to Priya, who will be conducting this interview.
That's great. It's like an instant replay.
An instant replay. Okay, well, I think we might be close to resolution soon. Let's just give that a moment.
Yeah. That's great. It's like there's nothing like hearing yourself talk.
Yeah, I know, poor Zelina, but thank you for introducing us. And Kamala, thank you so much for being here today. And, let's just crack on. Let's get right into it. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and how you first got into opera as your field?
Sure. I kind of had a roundabout way of getting into opera in that I was not supposed to become a musician. And Priya and I were just talking a little bit before starting this stream about how we're both come from these South Indian families. And I don't know if your experience was similar, but I was supposed to be a doctor. Like it was all kind of planned out. I was going to become a kidney doctor and take over my dad's practice, but that did not happen. My doctorate is actually in cognitive psychology, though not in music. So I was trying to follow on the path of something more practical. But as an undergrad, I went to a liberal arts school, so I studied composition and voice at the same time that I was working on my psychology credentials, and so while I was working on my doctorate, I was actually also performing quite a bit and continuing to write music. And eventually, more people just started to ask me to write things, and to the point that sort of took over, and the other focus on research sort of fell by the wayside. So I had a kind of a circuitous path into making opera.
Of course. I mean, that's really classic. I come from a full line of doctors going up 4 generations that I can remember off the top of my head, and I was very fortunate to have parents who were very supportive. But that is quite a common feature that we see from a lot of a lot of students or young people from minority backgrounds are often discouraged into going into the performing arts because it's considered like not reliable or something like that. Have you, over your time, have you seen a change in those attitudes? Do you think there's been a significant shift?
I think it is shifting. And again, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone in America, so I can only talk about what I've seen here. But in the time that I've been working in opera, when I first started out, I didn't know any other South Asian people who were in classical music at all, let alone opera. And now I'm constantly seeing not only young singers, but also composers, conductors, instrumentalists of different types. So I think that the shift is happening. Um, I think that it's also sort of concurrent with a shift in thinking in general, about how to be a minority culture in within the dominant culture. Again, speaking specifically about the United States, but what your place is and how to relate within that structure, if that makes sense.
Of course, I mean that absolutely makes sense, and I think that's especially an issue in opera because opera is often considered this high art. It's often associated with um, elite notions and a very particular privileged sector of society. Um, and a lot of your works, like from the content you deal with to your mediums and all of that, seems to go against the grain of those traditional expectations. How have your audiences developed, and how do you decide who your operas are targeted towards?
Well, I think I came into opera sort of by way of theater and musical theater. And that I just look at it as another form of musical storytelling. And so by focusing on that aspect of it rather than focusing on how it continues the tradition of opera, I think that you're able to find a way into connecting to more modern audiences. And if we look at the history, this is what any of the big name composers from the past would also have done. And you see Mozart putting things like Janissary music into his pieces because it was the rage at the time. You see other composers, more contemporary composers like the Gershwin or Menotti, drawing on folk forms, popular musics. And so I think the difference now is that our popular musics are like pop, really. And so it becomes, I think people get sort of attached to the idea of the high art, low art distinction because we're in the midst of a very particular kind of high art, low art distinction. But I actually don't think it's that different than what people have always been doing.
All right. I think that's I think that's such a unique perspective, and given given these ideas, and given what you said about borrowing from folk elements and things like that, can you tell us a bit about your compositional process? Like when, say, you're commissioned to write an opera, or you have an idea that's given you inspiration, how do you proceed with it? How do you come to realize it in its fully staged grand form?
Well, I think for me the first thing is to figure out how to create sort of a musical character. You know, why are these people singing in the first place, and what is it that the music can add to the story that uh, would make it different from a play, right? A play with music is a different thing than an opera because in an opera, the music is not just sort of supporting what the actors are doing, it's actually helping to create character and place and all of these other things. So for me, that's really the first step in the process is to figure out how do I musicalize these characters and this place and this moment. And so that often will mean, if it's a modern story, then that means drawing on modern kinds of influences and deciding what the musical characterization is going to be.
Right. Okay. And as you go on with this, I've noticed that some of your operas, like Thumbprint and Enchantress, deal with quite politically charged content. How do you deal with the treating of that? Because I feel that we as an artist, we have a responsibility that when we talk about social causes, we do it tactfully, responsibly, and perhaps with the aim of some impact. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that's always been important to me in making these pieces is telling stories that have relevance to the modern audience in a way that is grounded in their experience. So because we can watch Bohème and we've all experienced love, but it's not the same thing as something that is grounded in contemporary issues. So I've wanted to do this by trying to put people on stage that are not always there. So for Thumbprint, this is a Pakistani woman who is a human rights activist. For Enchantress, it's Ada Lovelace. So I guess a lot of them have really these sort of powerful women at the heart of them, and that's been important to me too. Just looking at the canon of opera, and usually powerful women in opera don't fare so well at the end. So it's been important to me to sort of create a new canon where these kinds of women sort of get to the end of their arc with their power intact.
Hmm. And I understand Thumbprint came about as after a series of interviews that you conducted. Is that correct?
Well, the librettist Susan Yankowitz, she had conducted a series of interviews with Mukhtar Mai, because she had actually written a play first, a sort of a dramatic monologue that then I had independently created a song cycle inspired by Mukhtar's autobiography, but it didn't feel quite complete. It felt like it wanted to be an opera. So I was introduced to Susan, and because she had already done these series of interviews, she was very familiar with Mukhtar's story and was kind of the ideal person to create the libretto.
Um, I mean, it's and just I think just reading the story honestly moves a lot of people, myself included. It's a big story to tell, and as a composer, as a director, like um what direction do you give the performers who are realizing your music?
I have a lot of trust in the performer, and so I leave a lot of room for them to interpret. And I would hope that the arc is built in enough into the music that they can sort of follow what their interpretation is. That being said, for me, the Thumbprint in particular is a story about finding your voice. And so it's actually a pretty challenging part because it starts off sitting squarely in the mid voice, and then about halfway through the piece, when Mukhtar makes the decision that she's going to pursue justice, then you start to get all of these high coloratura, virtuosic firework kind of things, but you've already sung half of a show sitting squarely in the middle of your range. So I think maybe that just having that built in, the performer has to struggle anyway. so so it's sort of it's method singing.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. After attempting the aria, I can definitely say that it's a lot of vocal gymnastics in the best way possible there. So would you say when performers are bringing a character to life that has lived before, that has brought the story out and had real world impact, they're the characterization of someone like that is through their own exploration and reflection on the music.
I think there's some of that, and I also think that we should always do due diligence and do our own research. Um, but it's always a challenge to create a character based on someone who is still alive. Not even to mention a biographical character, but someone who is still living. The last set of performances of Thumbprint that we had in LA a few years ago, Mukhtar actually came and watched them, and that was terrifying because you hope that you've done a good enough job in sort of portraying her story that she can watch it and feel like it is accurate enough. So I hope that Susan and I did a good enough job in creating the piece in the first place that the performer's job is not so difficult. Um, that being said, I'm really curious to see what different people's takes on the character is. We were supposed to have another production last summer that was canceled due to COVID. So there are a couple more that are possibly coming up if things open up again. So that's going to be interesting to see. I'm curious to see what you'll do with it when people are able to perform again.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that we can see your music staged here in the UK as well. I think that will be a dream, and fingers crossed that sooner rather than later. Yeah, so on the topic of you had said that Mukhtar came to watch one of your performances and things like that, and her story is compelling to say the least, inspirational, and also deeply painful in many other ways. And when dealing with a topic like violence against women, how does that come across on stage? Because I know I've in my degree, studied about how violence has been depicted on stage, and according to today's standards, rightfully so, there are limits, and there's a way to do it ethically and respectfully. So when dealing with violence, how do we stage something like that?
Well, we had conversations about this early on, me and Susan, and it was very important to us that it not feel accidentally titillating in any way and that it not feel exploitive. And so the way that we decided to approach this was to really take the perspective of Mukhtar herself. And victims of sexual assault often report feeling like they're kind of out of body, looking down on themselves. And so we decided that rather than theatricalizing the assault on her, we would go to that space, that sort of out of body mental space. And so she has this aria that none of the arias in the show really have names, but I call it darkness because this is the one place in the whole piece that the text comes entirely from her autobiography. And she says, I moved from darkness into darkness, from night into another night. And that sort of encapsulates what the whole experience is. And, I think when approaching something like this, it is really important to be careful and thoughtful about it. And I hope that we were able to do that. It's a lot of trust to take a scene like this, and to let it go into the world and see what other people do with it. And yeah, I'm hoping that we have made it in such a way that it won't ever become exploitive and not centering Mukhtar's experience. But again, I don't know. We'll see. I guess that's the challenge of also being a living composer, is you get to see what
Mhm.
other people do with your work when you're not there.
Sure. I mean, hopefully, for young composers and young artists, myself included, I think we see it both as a challenge, but also something to learn from. And I think as artists, we never do stop learning, right? I think that's so interesting what you said about an out of body experience when you're, dealing with the emotional turmoil this character has gone through. And as you mentioned, you have a background in psychology. So how has that informed your music making?
Well, my research area was really in linguistics and psycholinguistics and how language is used in context. So I really do think that has a direct correlation to the way that I approach writing. I think a lot about things like leitmotif and semiotics, and how music can come to sort of stand in for things within the world of the piece. So that could be something as noticeable as a theme, but it could also be internal harmonic progressions that mean something to me as the composer that no one else might pick up on, but I know that they're there. So it's kind of like creating a puzzle in a way.
Yeah, of course. And how do you think, just looking at your works, how do you think that's influenced the output of your operas? Do you do you like that the music is introspective rather than narrative? Like, how do you think that's come across? Because it's obviously two fields you're so knowledgeable and experienced in, and I'm just curious to know how it affects the output.
I think that it's more noticeable in some places than in others. In writing Thumbprint, I very specifically chose the ragas that I used based on their emotional content. So I think in some of them you can hear that, but in some of them it might not be obvious to somebody who is listening. But I know what it means, and that's also true in other things like. In looking at you, for example, the data mining show I just did, when the characters are at their tech company, the music has more electronic accompaniment. But then when they're sort of having an interior moment, an introspection, then there are no electronics. It's totally acoustic. So even something as below the surface as the choice of which instruments to use when, that can also become sort of imbued with meaning. And I think that's why we make opera, is to sort of give these extra layers of meaning to these stories through the use of music.
Yeah, I mean, that leads really beautifully onto our next set of questions, which is about technology. And you had mentioned earlier how you approach opera as, storytelling, and you've dealt with so many of these narratives. What does technology offer you in storytelling as a composer?
Well, I think that as we've definitely seen over the course of the last 9 months, all being stuck inside on Zoom, technology is really interwoven into the modern experience. And so it would make sense to look for ways to integrate that part of our experience into the stories that we're telling. And the other part of it is just accessibility. So I think that one of the challenges that opera faces is, as you mentioned before, there's this sort of idea about it as being rather elitist. And that idea is only compounded by the fact that it's difficult to go and see it. Not only is it that often you're sort of constrained by the kinds of theatrical spaces you can use, but that those spaces are usually located in places that are not easily accessible by everyone. And of course, this is again more the case in America than it is in Europe. In Europe, most smaller towns have an opera house of some kind, so you could probably go see something there. But in America in particular, we don't have that many opera houses, and we definitely don't have a lot of opera houses large enough to really sustain the kinds of grand pieces that we think of when we think of the opera. So using things like even using video, using amplification, it may seem like a small thing, but if you are able to amplify, you can take a rough warehouse space and you can turn it into something that works acoustically. Otherwise, you couldn't do anything in there. With video, you can allow people to see a piece that they would never ever see otherwise. So there is something inherently democratizing, I think, about using the technologies that we have now to reach people where they are. And then I think, once people have seen what it could be, then I think that maybe they'll be more likely to actually make the journey to go see it in the opera house. But
Mhm.
but because there's no way in for a lot of people, I think that that's one of the things that we run up against. Yeah, so that's sort of what's behind a lot of the work and with technology, is just finding new ways to engage modern audiences and to reach people where they are.
And when you work with when you work with like a virtual medium or like an online format or virtual reality, even, which I'm very excited to hear about personally, do you find that your key audience demographic changes as well, or who you have in mind as watching your work changes too?
Oh, definitely. So the virtual reality piece, the first virtual reality piece that I did, this was back in 2015, and so it was done in a partnership with Samsung VR, which at that time they were interested in looking for artistic experiences. They've since pivoted to doing mostly industrial use, like teaching people how to use motors and that kind of thing. Um, but what was interesting about that is I did that piece as a collaboration with a small company based here in New York. And in the first month that the piece was online, it had something like 14,000 views, which is much more than you would normally be able to put into a black box theater. And the other interesting thing about it is that for a lot of them, the people that we got feedback from, they were gamers. They were not opera people. And so I think that there was a bit of a learning curve early on, because the kind of piece that you make for somebody who is more used to video games is not necessarily going to be the same thing that you would make as a traditional opera. Um, so we are now looking at revisiting that piece and sort of reworking it a bit now that the technology is better, because it was the first opera that a lot of people saw. Um, and hopefully some of those people liked it and went out and saw other operas after that. I don't really know. We didn't have a way to track all of them, but I find that very interesting. And with looking at you also, even though that was a piece that was done in a theater, because what we did was we data mined the audience in real time and put their information into the show. And because of that, we had a lot of tech people coming in, and people who were more interested in surveillance, capitalism, and that kind of thing, who again had not been to an opera before. So I guess that's sort of my goal with a lot of these, is to make them the gateway piece, that you go to one and you realize, oh, I actually like this, and then you go to others. But the first step is getting people in the door, or getting them to listen or watch, before we can get them to commit to going to the opera house itself.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I love this idea that by putting out opera that's easily accessible, putting out opera that's, friendly to people who've never engaged with opera before, we actually encourage them into opera houses. But from that perspective, with funding bodies, opera houses, government, public funding, because I know obviously public funding works very differently in the States, in the UK, other countries in Europe. But across the map, how willing are people to fund virtual opera projects?
Hmm. Um, it's been interesting, because, as you mentioned, in America, we do not have a lot of public funding for the arts. That's a whole story we could talk about. But so most of the funding for opera companies, arts in general, comes from foundations or from private donors. And so early on, the funding for that first virtual reality piece came from Samsung, but then they realized that they weren't going to make a lot of money doing opera, so they pivoted away from that. I had another piece that was done as a virtual reality, in a virtual reality format this past September, where the singers were in motion capture suits, and they were sort of controlling digital avatars that people could then follow in headset. And that piece was funded through a combination of foundation grants and individual donations. So, and the challenge in the United States is, if you can find somebody who wants to fund your project because they're interested in virtual reality, then you can go about doing that. But you end up being kind of reliant on these single large donor people. I have seen more virtual reality work and more technology work coming out of the Netherlands, because I think that they have a very good infrastructure for sort of pushing the boundaries of what opera performance could be. I don't know if the composer Michael van der Aa, I've seen several of his projects that are sort of testing what you could do with VR and with video and other things. So I mean, I think the opportunity is there. It's just going to be different from one country to another. I suspect the UK is more similar to the United States than to the Netherlands, so you may have a little more of a push to get it going. But that doesn't mean it isn't possible. Like the virtual reality piece I did in 2015, we had very little funding, and instead we just met and worked with a company, a VR company that was just starting out and wanted to have some kind of a flagship project that they could show other people. We borrowed cameras from other people, so there are scrappy ways of doing it as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, because I think until very recently, if someone said virtual opera, the only thing that would come to mind is, Royal Opera filming their stage performances and screening it. But I think works like yours show that there's so many unique ways to engage with technology. And to that note, how do you think performers have responded to these changes? Because for me personally, in my little, amateur performing space, it feels really surreal to me in my tiny little studio flat, setting my iPhone up on a tripod and filming myself. So, what's a good way to work with performers using these virtual formats and in the world today with the pandemic and everything?
I think this is an opportunity for performers to become empowered in a way about what you sound like. Because one of the things that I realized about a lot of classical singers in particular is that they don't know about microphones and they don't know about audio technology. And because of that, even when you go into a professional recording situation, you're often sort of at the mercy of whoever happens to be engineering that session, even as a professional. So now is a good time to start to figure out, what microphone sounds good with my voice, because it's not going to necessarily be your iPhone. And so if you have a little extra money, which you may or may not, you can invest in some kind of a, large diaphragm microphone, a condenser microphone, or a ribbon microphone of some kind, just because your voice has such a huge dynamic range that a little tiny microphone is not going to cut it. So, so that's, I think, something that I have noticed during the pandemic is just people starting to learn more about digital audio and how they can create a home setup for themselves that best reflects what they sound like. And I think that that's going to translate into, even when we come out of this, having more of an awareness of your own ability to control what you sound like on recordings. And I do think that that is going to continue to be the primary way that people experience music. Um, it's just too easy to listen to something while you're walking around, having it through your headphones. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that it's a gateway. You hear a recording of an opera, you want to go see the opera, and this is how it works with other kinds of music also. People download a Beyonce album and then decide if they want to go see the stadium tour or not. So it's not necessarily just specific to our field. I think if we look at it as just a way of communicating with more people, then that will help us to get the music out there.
Yeah, of course. One of our audience members asked if you'd say you think that digital opera will become as popular as live performances. So, do you want to just?
Sure. I mean, in my dream world, there would be as many types of opera as there are types of Netflix shows, right? So you can have your little niche of people who love digital opera. You can have people who only want to see opera live. I don't think they necessarily cancel each other out, and I don't, I think that um, I think that they can actually help each other. I think the people that watch a digital opera and really, really enjoy it, they may not like a live opera because they may be looking for different things. But in the end, it can only be mutually beneficial to have more people that are really interested in opera as an art form as a whole. So I don't know if that completely answered your question, but
I think that's definitely very insightful. And for composers out there, I mean, when you come up with a concept for a virtual reality opera or one like looking at you, uh, is your mindset a lot different from when you're conceptualizing a traditionally staged opera? And
oh,
how is that different? Is it from conception? Is it the technology itself that you're building on, or is it a tool that you use?
I think it must be from conception. I mean, the otherwise why do it? That it's like Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. And I think that the medium is the art form in this case. As we've seen, this is why a lot of the early sort of live stream videos coming from opera companies were not satisfying, is because they were not created to be videos. They were meant to be seen on a stage in a theater. And if you intend something to be a video, then you're going to create it very differently. Look at the techniques of film. Like right now, we're in these boxes, right? And we're very close up, and it feels like we're having this intimate conversation. Whereas if I like move way back from you, all of a sudden, it's a very different feeling, right? So in creating for video, you have to be aware of where the camera is, and you create for the box. And if you don't have that in mind from the beginning, then it's not going to be a good fit. There are all of these other affordances that these new technologies give us that we have to be aware of from the beginning. Like, I have also seen productions of new opera that try to add amplification at the last minute, and invariably they have a lot of problems, because it shouldn't be used to compensate for something that isn't orchestrated intentionally. Like, you still have to think about how you are using your instruments and why you're using them the way that you are. So I definitely think that technology is not a panacea. It has to be used in a dramaturgical and thoughtful fashion in order for it to work well.
Mm-hmm. And to that note, again on the topic of virtual reality, we have an audience question saying, "Your opera, The Parksville Murders, was a first VR opera. How does this affect the politics of performance? And do you think we're going to be seeing more VR operas produced around the world?" I'm assuming by politics of performance, they mean, again, the transformation in medium with accessibility, and the fact that there's so many new fields and topics and subtopics that are open to us politically, even.
I think that VR has the ability to really capture what it feels like to hear an opera performance. And as you know, the voice interacts with the space around it. And so listening to a 2D recording where it's kind of flattened, it's not really what it's like to go to a theater. So that's what's exciting about VR, is that it allows you to step inside of an opera performance and actually hear the voices the way that they should be heard. Um, that being said, it's really expensive, like very, very expensive. And I think the adaptation of VR headsets is not widespread enough to really make it a viable alternative at this point. So, what I see happening more is the use of augmented reality, which I think the Royal Shakespeare Company already did some of this in The Tempest, like creating an augmented reality version of Ariel. Um, and that's sort of more where I see it going. If you can have like a tiny little Renee Fleming sitting on your hand and singing an aria to you, who wouldn't want that? So I, I think we may see widespread use of VR headsets at some point in time, but it's not happening right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that reminds me of, I think it was in 2017 where there was a hologram tour of Maria Callas, albeit with some very, very mixed responses. And it, opened up this whole can of worms of, if an artist has deceased, how should we be using their work, and whatnot. But the way you described, just interfacing with virtual reality or augmented reality, do you think the role of an opera director is almost similar to the role of a film director in terms of using that interface and, dealing with such expensive equipment in addition to your human resources?
Well, it's interesting, right? So creating a piece for virtual reality is more similar to creating for the theater, because you are not controlling where the audience looks, right? That's the real fundamental difference between the gaze in the theater and the gaze in film, is that in film, the audience is only looking at the screen. And so you decide if it's a close up, you decide if you're cutting to something else, you decide where they're looking at all times. Whereas in the theater, because it's this three-dimensional experience, if you don't do a good job focusing them with lights or with whatever other tools you're using, they're not going to look where you want them to look. So I actually think theater directors are really fantastic for VR because they're already used to working in 3 dimensions and knowing how to pull focus towards something without being able to use a camera edit. That being said, a lot of the directors that I know right now are facing this challenge in that in the last 9 months, as everything moved online, they're suddenly expected to be film directors. And that's a whole other set of tools and techniques, which, a lot of the people that I know, they're learning them now, but it's not necessarily what their expertise is. So I think that we're headed towards some kind of a hybrid, actually. Some of the streams that I've seen recently are staged on a stage, but they're filmed like a film. So it's a combination of stage technique, but then also with additional cuts between cameras and close-ups and all of these other things.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see if it continues.
You know what? I hope it does. And I think another question that quite relates to what you said, that's probably a common thread across all our talks, of course, is what advice you'd give young composers, particularly ones who want to go into, theatre direction and composition involving all these technological mediums, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most important thing you can do as a young composer is to try things out and to make things. And I my own path to doing this was, a lot of it was because I was making things on my own without sort of the imprimatur of some kind of a program or network or any of that. I just made things and eventually people looked at them. Um, and so I think if there's something that interests you, particularly when you're first starting out, you should go for it and try and make it and see what happens. And maybe it will fail terribly, but you'll have learned something anyway. You can only fail upward, I think. And especially now, because we're all in this time where everything is up in the air and uncertain, I find that audiences are really forgiving. Like, you put a live stream concert online and it's not perfect, it doesn't matter, because even the people that are top level pros, they're not doing things that are perfect either. I mean, I don't know if you saw some of those Metropolitan Opera live stream concerts. Not perfect. So if they can get away with not being perfect, then you can. Yeah, I guess that would be my advice: is don't wait to make things.
Yeah, I mean, I love that idea of just kind of, almost being a bit vulnerable as a creator or as a performer, and getting your work out there. Another, again, very common question from our audiences is about the Black Lives Matter movement, that obviously gained new levels of popularity, notoriety, and impact in 2020, particularly in the United States. And how do you think US-based opera companies responded to BLM?
It's been mixed. And I should say, like, it's hard, I think, if you're not from the US to understand the sort of depth of the difficulty with race that exists in the United States, because the entire capitalist system, the mercantile system in the United States, was created built on the backbone of slavery. And so that is inherent from our founding, and we have never, ever really had a national reckoning with it. I mean, to some degree in the 60s during the civil rights movement, but the conversations that have been happening now are way overdue. And I think that it can be frightening for companies in the United States because of the way that the funding structure works. As I mentioned before, you're really dependent on individual donations to a large degree, especially the larger size companies. And so that means that you are constantly afraid of offending the wrong person and having them pull their funding. So the conversations are happening slowly. I am very involved with Opera America, which is the advocacy organization for opera based in the United States. They have convened a racial justice steering committee. Their meetings, and they're convening this past week and going forward into March, is really focused around issues for creators of color, artists of color, and trying to find ways to empower them. They've started a new series of grants for creators of color. And I think, this is the way that it will probably have to start, is through money, because that's where the fear is around money. So the conversations are happening. There is slow change happening, and I think, just have to keep pushing forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And on that note, I think with opera companies having, like you said, a long overdue discussion about race and representation on stage, I think I've definitely had that experience where when I've watched productions of Lakme or Le Pêche de Perles, which is already written through quite an Orientalist lens, and seeing a Caucasian European woman embody that role, there's a sense of discomfort to it. But your music, on the other hand, like in Thumbprint, you've combined elements of Hindustani music and European opera music, and I mean, am I right in saying that your cultural background, of course, influenced the introduction of those folk elements and those folk materials? So, as a South Indian woman using those elements, you are kind of reshaping opera music making in many ways, and trying to unsettle and unravel those previous, like, Orientalist traditions in the present time. So how do you use your experiences and your cultural background, your upbringing, family life, or any of that in your music?
I think it's always present to some degree, and this is why we listen to different artists, because all of us have an inherently different perspective, right? My growing up in the United States with a South Indian father and a white mother, and you know spending a large part of my childhood in a very small town in the desert in California, all of those things have an impact on the way that I see the world and the way that I interpret it. And so the piece that I made about Mukhtar Mai is specific to me. If somebody else had made the piece, it may not have had the elements that it had. And part of it for me was, how do I blend all of these different aspects of my experience and bring them together in a way that is cohesive and makes sense? And I think that that's why it's important to have more diverse, and this word gets overused, but what we mean by diversity of experience is just that, is that the experience of someone growing up as an Indian in America is also going to be different from somebody growing up as an Indian in the UK. Is also going to be different from somebody growing up as an Indian in India. And yet these experiences are all valid and may lead to these really beautiful different perspectives on the world. And I think that's where we want. We want the beautiful diversity of perspective that is out there, because that enriches all of us. And that's the heart of what the world is all of these wonderful, beautiful, different people who make it up.
Mm-hmm. I think that term, diversity of perspective, I really like that. I think that's going to stick with me for quite a long time. And on that topic of diversity, in your experience, what has it been like being a woman in opera composition. And there's that we got quite a few questions from audience members about the advice you'd give to young women composers starting out.
Um, I would say trust yourself. Um, when I first started out, there were several times where my credentials have been called into question, or I remember I've been called cute, I've been called soft. There have been many things along the way, and so what I had to learn was, do I trust what I'm doing, and who do I trust to give me feedback when I need criticism? Um, because I think that there are a couple of things facing us as women composers. One is just the sort of gendered lens with which the world is viewed by many people. So there's a whole, I think, a burgeoning body of research on this is gendered language and being used to describe female professors, female artists. So that is definitely there. But the other part of it that we don't always talk about is also the network. Um, like as a female composer, I didn't have a female teacher of composition for a long time. I didn't have a mentor. So it can feel lonely, and it can feel kind of like you're the only one out there doing it. And I think that it's gotten better now, in that there are many more female composers that I see out there who are actively trying to mentor and to help young composers so that they don't have to feel like they're out there sort of struggling to make it by themselves, because that's sort of built in from the beginning for most men, is that it's easier to find a mentor and it's easier to find a network. So I would say trust in the work, but also don't be afraid to ask for help. If there is somebody that you see that you like what they're doing, email them. That's not something that we're taught to do as women, to be assertive, but we can be. And worst case scenario, they don't write back. And I think that, that was another thing that I had to learn, is to ask for advice, ask for help. Don't feel like I have to do it myself. There are people out there that will help. And yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely really inspirational. And from what you said, I mean, definitely in the UK, it's quite a concerning trend that in GCSE A level classes and even in university, the women definitely outnumber men as students. But then as you go higher up the ladder, or the corporate ladder in some of the big opera houses, then it becomes very much one-dimensional at the top. So I guess my question is, where do you think the responsibility lies? Is it these corporations higher up? Is it public bodies, audiences, artists ourselves? Where do you think the responsibility to make that change lies?
I think it has to lie with us in the society as a whole. Um, the I can only talk about the United States because that's where my experience is. But the general and artistic directors of large companies are selected by the boards. So who's on the board? We have to look there. If the board isn't diverse enough, then their hiring isn't going to be as diverse. The senior staff, are they women? Are they people of color? Because if they're not, then it becomes less likely again that they're going to reach out and hire more representative staff. The challenge that we face as humans in general is that we tend to think of people that are more like us. We tend to have networks that are more like us. And so unless there are things like, I don't know if quotas are the way to go, but I think there has to be a concerted effort on the part of people who are in the positions to make these decisions, to say, okay, I need to at least invite women and people of color into the room for auditions and for interviews and for all of that. And if they're not actively making that commitment to do that, then it becomes much harder. It's not going to happen without an intentional effort. So what can we do as audiences? Um, we can say we will choose to give our patronage to places that are acting in a more equitable manner. I think there are things that you could do from the top down. It's just a question of looking at what your place is in the sort of the structure, and making your idea about what you can do based on that. I mean, even as a performer, what you can do is say, okay, my audition repertoire is all white male composers. Maybe I'm gonna have my contemporary aria be from somebody who is not white and male. If I'm a professor, I can say, okay, if I'm teaching about rhythm and pitch, do I have to only use examples from the European classical canon, or can I go to Mali? Can I pick something from India that would equally well demonstrate what pitch is and what rhythm is? I think that there are things that we can do at every level, and once we all start doing those things, then we'll see a change.
Mm-hmm. I think I really like that idea, and I think I will definitely work that into my practice as well. And I think as I've grown older, I've definitely come into my own and found my own little, cultural nook of the world that I enjoy working with and want to continue to work with. And that's that's why we do these talks, so that people are encouraged to, do the same and follow their gut instinct more than anything. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll just go to a couple of questions from the audience members before we wrap it up. So one of them is about working with librettists. So they've said you've worked a lot with different librettists, and as a librettist yourself, does your composition process change depending on who you work with, and if so, how?
Oh yeah, it definitely does. Um, it it really depends on the relationship with the other person, which is part of why I prefer to work with a librettist rather than writing my own libretti, because it forces me outside of being totally comfortable, which usually ends up making a better piece. There are some librettists who like to talk and have feedback and conversations through the whole process of creating the story. There are others that would prefer to be left alone and just give me a finished draft. And so when I am thinking about who to bring on for a project, if I am allowed to think about who to bring on for a project, it kind of depends on what the feel of the piece is going to be, and how the working relationship that I have with that person will affect what the eventual mood of the piece is meant to be. But I'm very lucky in that I have met several people that I have good working relationships with. And so I think that that's really the key component, is to find people that you can argue with, and that you'll still be okay at the end of it. It's a skill, learning to collaborate. It's not something that happens naturally. You have to practice.
I'm sure, I'm sure. And the final question that I've got here is, traditional opera goers are often older. Do you think that digital opera will engage more young people? And I guess you could also add your input on the importance of young people in the future of opera, which I'm sure a lot of, especially the students and aspiring composers, would love to hear.
Yeah, I think that anything that can bring in younger people is important to do. So digital opera is one version of that, but it's also just taking opera out of the opera house. Here in the United States, I work quite a bit with a company called Opera on Tap, and what they do is they get young singers to sing arias in bars, so in pubs. So they, they just you go to the pub, you're having a beer, and someone starts belting out Caro Nome, and maybe you've never heard that before, and maybe you don't like it, but maybe you do. Just the fact of taking it and putting it in this situation where it's not intimidating, I think that's a huge part of it, because there are all of these cultural norms that we ascribe with going to the theater that if you don't know what they are, like I've heard people tell me, I don't want to go because I don't know if I'm dressed right, I don't know if I'm allowed to clap. There are all of these other things that have nothing to do with the opera itself. And I think it's not just digital opera, it's just changing the norms around what it means to listen to and go to the opera. That's how to engage more people. And I do think it's important for opera to continue to be a viable art form, is to allow audiences to expand and to see that it's relevant to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's all the time that we have today. But I think that was a really inspiring and informative and insightful 1 hour. And, we're so thankful for it, despite, being tiny little boxes on the screen. And to our audience, thank you so much for being here. That was Dr. Kamala Sankaram. And as always, all our talks are available at any time on your YouTube page, so on our YouTube channel. So if you tuned in a little bit late, this is going to be available. So Kamala, thank you so much for being here today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So that just leads me to wrap up everything. I wanted to say a huge thank you to Kamala. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights. And also thank you to Priya for interviewing Kamala. It's been such an insightful and interesting talk. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you both. Our next event is with Dame Jane Glover, the acclaimed musicologist and conductor. So she will be joining us next Tuesday, which is the 9th of February at 6 p.m. UK time. In the meantime, all of our talks are available on our website or our YouTube channel, and please subscribe to our social media channels as well. Thank you so much, Kamala and Priya, and to everyone else, have a great evening. I think we should stop streaming now.